they're using this term petroleum-based. Those of us who know better should not be echoing these talking points. These are not petroleum-based dyes. That is a scare tactic that, again, is not science-based and should not be used in common parlance, especially amongst experts.
Hello, and welcome to FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. I've been involved with FDA in one way or another for several decades. At one point, I was an associate commissioner at the agency. I've authored or edited 16 books about FDA.
And I'm Shelly Garg, and I'm the managing partner and founder of Garg Law, a full-service FDA-focused law firm. I have been on the private side advising companies on regulatory compliance and enforcement issues for the last 15 years.
By now, you should know what to expect from FDA Watch. We've been broadcasting since the beginning of this year. We're an independent, nonpartisan national forum for discussing the latest developments and trends and issues surrounding FDA.
And if you haven't subscribed yet, do so today at fdawatch.net. You'll be the first to receive an email when a new episode drops, including bonus episodes when there's breaking news. Plus, you'll get quick access to our headlines and resource links, as well as some background about our guests.
In this episode, we're going to focus on food issues. We're going to talk about supply. We're going to talk about tariffs, infant formula, counterfeiting. We have two terrific guests to help discuss these topics. You'll meet them in just a moment.
But first, Wayne, let's get to some headlines.
And there are a lot of headlines right now. First up, FDA has announced expanded use of unannounced inspections at foreign manufacturing facilities, which include those that produce foods, medicines, and other medical products intended for American consumers and patients. The program builds on FDA's Foreign Unannounced Inspection Pilot Program in India and China, and it aims to place the same level of regulatory oversight and scrutiny on foreign companies as on domestic companies. FDA actually conducts about 3,000 foreign inspections a year, more than 90 countries, and despite the fact that the foreign firms typically get an advanced warning, the agency has said that it still found more than double the amount of serious deficiencies in foreign inspections compared to domestic inspections. One other headline, President Trump just signed an executive order that aims to reduce drug costs by basing payments for certain medicines on their prices in other countries. This is an issue that's been discussed for a long time. Trump made clear that he believes that the executive order will drastically lower drug prices. It's unclear how it will work, but it certainly has been a huge issue for the entire pharmaceutical industry, and we'll be watching it. Finally, from the pharma desk, Commissioner Makary, new commissioner at FDA, said layoffs will not hinder the agency's target dates for drug reviews. He posted an interview, or he did not post it, he did an interview that was posted on Inside Medicine Substack, where he said that FDA will meet its targets for completing reviews of new drugs despite the recent layoffs and despite the concerns expressed by industry. He also said there are no plans for a major reorganization at the agency. We'll be tracking very closely the pace of drug approvals, and we'll see how successful Dr. Makary is at meeting the PDUFA dates. As for product decision-making, in the same interview, Makary noted that he could make independent decisions at FDA. There's been some concern expressed in the media about the role that Secretary Kennedy and others may have over FDA decisions, but Makary said, and I quote, "No one above me has been or will be making decisions on products. Secretary Kennedy may have strong recommendations, which he has a right to, but I make my decisions based on the two guiding principles of gold standard science and common sense." Finally, from the device desk, two U.S. Senator Mike Rounds and Martin Hahn introduced legislation encouraging the use of AI-enabled medical devices. Senator Rounds, who's a Republican from South Dakota, Senator Heinrich, a Democrat from Mexico, are co-chairs of the Senate Artificial Intelligence Caucus, and they introduced legislation meant to establish a consistent and predictable Medicare payment pathway for AI-enabled devices. More specifically, the act is intended to develop a formalized payment pathway for FDA-approved devices, to provide patients with access to AI-enabled clinical technology, and to provide manufacturers and providers with an incentive to invest in the development of new healthcare technologies. This legislation is endorsed by a lot of groups, AdvaMed, the Alliance for Aging Research, the National Health Council, several other industry organizations. We'll keep an eye on how this legislation fares in the coming months.
Thanks, Wayne. From the Foods Desk, HHS and FDA are set to phase out petroleum-based synthetic dyes in the nation's food supply. This has been the big news in the last couple weeks. FDA announced a series of new measures to phase out all petroleum-based synthetic dyes from the nation's food supply as part of the administration's broader initiative to make America healthy again. The FDA is establishing a national standard and timeline for the food industry to again transition from petrochemical-based dyes to natural alternatives, initiating the process to revoke authorization for two synthetic food colorings, citrus red number 2 and orange B, within the coming months, and working with the industry to eliminate 6 remaining synthetic dyes, including FD&C green 3, red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue 1, and blue 2. By the end of next year. FDA is also authorizing 4 new natural color additives, while also aiming to accelerate review and approval of several others. The agency is also requesting that food companies remove Red 3 sooner than the 27-28 deadline. From the Cosmetics Desk, in an effort to boost regulator confidence in animal-free methods for assessing cosmetic product safety, the International Collaboration on Cosmetic Safety shared case studies and mock dossiers as examples of how new approach methodologies can be utilized, according to a story from HBW Insight. ICCS CEO Aaron Hill said the organization is engaging closely with regulators to promote acceptance of alternative methods. According to the article, working directly with regulators is helping ICCS clarify how to comply with FDA's roadmap to phase out animal testing for drugs and monoclonal antibody therapies. ICCS is also looking to hold a workshop with FDA to hear what it needs on the data front. Now, Wayne, let's meet our really fantastic guest for today's episode.
Thank you, Shelly. Joining us today is Tony Pavel. Tony's a partner at Keller and Heckman, a law firm in Washington. He represents clients on foods, food additives, and dietary supplements, and cosmetic issues. Welcome to FDA Watch, Tony.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here with you.
Also joining us today is Martin Hahn. Martin is a partner at Hogan Lovells, global regulatory practice. He helps clients navigate through the countless regulatory and business issues impacting the industry from farm to table. Welcome to FDA Watch, Martin.
Great. Thanks, Shelly. Great to be here.
So let me ask the first question. What are the most pressing global supply chain vulnerabilities the FDA is currently monitoring in the food sector? Tony, we'll start with you, then turn to Martin.
So I don't know that the FDA has published that directly. I think right now, I think there's a combination of issues going on. And A is looking at the supply as it's being tested by tariffs for materials that are used for manufacturing in the U.S. I think that's at the top of everybody's mind. As I think we'll probably discuss a little bit later, infant formula supply and the ingredients that are being used in there. And then probably more broadly, just continuing to monitor for adulteration and economic adulteration of incoming both foods and ingredients.
I think Tony and I are both flummoxed by that question because the reality is FDA is not monitoring anything that they should be monitoring with regard to supply chain issues. I find it very interesting that we're now seeing the Trump administration focusing on drugs coming out of China, focusing on pricing, and also looking at active pharmaceutical ingredients. There's been no mention of the fact that today, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, but an overwhelming majority of all the vitamins that we currently procure in this country are coming out of China. China has become a number one supplier of vitamins and minerals. And folks, if we don't have vitamins and minerals, we die. We die unless you happen to consume a diet that has all of your essential vitamins and minerals. And so when I look at supply chains and I look at potential vulnerabilities, I would be focusing, if I were in this administration, trying to build up local domestic manufacturing of these critical components of our food supply that if we don't have, we don't exist.
No, I totally agree, Martin. And not only for human food, but animal food as well is completely, all the micronutrients going into our animal feed supply are largely sourced from China.
And without that vitamin D, those dogs don't live.
I just wanted to follow up. What should FDA be concerned about in terms of the global supply chain?
So I'll go first. I think if you're looking at global supply chains, it really depends on what your perspective is. And there are many different angles that if you're in charge of FDA that you have to be considering multiple different angles. One is supply chain availability so that we can have affordable prices of goods in this country. And that, of course, is being directly impacted by tariffs. And so focusing on where are goods coming, and I'm looking at a lot of fresh produce comes out of both Canada in the summertime, as well as Mexico, Central America in the wintertime. A lot of times that fresh produce is going directly to a U.S. manufacturer where it's going to be produced by Americans here in the U.S. of A., making products that are going to go onto our grocery shelves. So I think that's something that the administration should consider. But I also think that there should be a critical look, and we're seeing the agency do this certainly for active pharmaceutical ingredients, looking at where our vulnerabilities are, but they should be looking at key food ingredients and vitamins and minerals. I raised it because those are ingredients that if we do not have access to them, you can actually have severe adverse consequences on health. So I think it's a multifaceted lens that requires a much broader look than just focusing on one simple issue.
And I just add in, Martin, too, in addition to vitamins and minerals, which are going to be the most critical, but there's a whole range of other foodstuffs that we just can't produce or can't produce in any real quantity in the U.S. So think coffee, tea, vanilla, all these things that are part of the everyday diet for most Americans, which we can't or don't grow in the country and have to come in through global supply chains.
Thanks, Tony. And sort of kind of capturing this conversation with respect to tariffs, can you talk a little bit more about how U.S. tariffs on imported food products, continue and will continue to influence the availability and safety oversight of essential goods like formula or medical nutrition? And then also, what sort of coordination exists between FDA and other agencies like USTR or USDA to really balance trade policy with food security and public health?
Sure, and I think from that tariff, I think there's two pieces, right? There's the general cost implications that come when there are products that are sourced externally.
Sure.
But then there's a larger concern around sort of tariff avoidance and the redirection of products to try to get to lower tariffs. And right there, you basically are creating an instant gray market where you always have more opportunity for potential mischief,
Sure.
and whether that's economic adulteration or intentional or dilution, it creates an incentive to basically work around traceability.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Martin, any comments?
Yeah, so just in terms of infant formula and also looking at some of these metabolic products where if you have an unborn heir of metabolism, you're required to have a very specialized diet. Many of these products could in fact be made in Europe. And so it's really important that we have access to those products because they're feeding a population that is relying on them for their everyday nutrition. So trying to make certain that we have these products readily available. I think on the infant formula side, I'm not quite certain how much of our infant formula is being imported into this country right now. Certainly during the crisis, we had increased availability and flexibility. But my sense is that domestic manufacturers are largely able to meet much of the U.S. market. Now, things get a little more complicated when you start looking at Canada because so many of the U.S. manufacturers could have co-manufacturing operations in Canada or Mexico. And so when you start looking at tariffs between Canada and Mexico, that could add to at least the cost, but hopefully it's not going to adversely impact availability.
But your vitamins and minerals comes back into play there, right, Martin?
It sure does.
Yep.
It sure does.
Martin and Tony, last question before the break. In light of recent geopolitical tensions and post-pandemic, how is FDA working with international partners to improve coordination and transparency? Tony, again, let's start with you on this and then turn to Martin.
If at all, I guess we should add, Martin.
Yeah, my answer is I don't know right now. I don't think there's perhaps Martin has deeper insight here, but I don't think there's been any transparency as to that in the last number of months.
But there's actually some significant concerns. As I was meeting with some of the folks at FDA the other day, and they have been part of the Codex Alimentarius, where we have all these various committees that are designed to create standards for the food industry. And FDA has been first and foremost, and these standards ultimately work their way into law in many parts of the world. And the folks who historically have been part of these meetings, whether it be the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives or the Codex Committee on Food Additives and Contaminants or Codex Committee on Contaminants, they don't know if they're going to be able to be part of these deliberations this year, let alone what's going to happen next year because of our pulling out of these various international bodies. And so there has been an absence of transparency and a great deal of confusion in terms of where we as the United States can be on the international market. And quite frankly, it makes me anxious to have the Europeans setting policy and FDA is on the sidelines. I don't think that's good for U.S. policy or world policy.
And to be clear, industry and stakeholders have written prior to this administration, had to write letters of support to make sure FDA was funded to participate in Codex. And Martin raises an excellent point. There's very little clarity. My understanding is that there were some USDA reps who were able to go to the last Codex meeting, but FDA was not present. And I would also note, just from an American leadership position, it's so critical that we have our representation at Codex in setting these global standards, whether for additives or food safety.
So what would you advise your clients or companies to do about the challenges that we've discussed so far? Tony, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think part of this is working, and most companies are doing this, working with our trade associations to issue statements of support for the agency, as well as the international activities that FDA participates in. Even beyond Codex, my understanding is a number of the folks from in FDA's international office in Geneva have been recalled in the course of the last number of months. And again, voicing support and helping to understand that FDA not only protects the American people, but it also helps us do business both in the U.S. and globally.
These are unprecedented times. I mean, the industry is under attack right now by this administration. I keep advising my clients, take a deep breath, count to 10. Tomorrow, the rules will change. And the day after they're going to change again. You can fret about tariffs. There's nothing you can do about them right now. That's ultimately going to work its way through the system. But try to maintain contacts with the folks who still are at FDA. Make certain that you have reached out to your representatives on the Hill, because we need to make certain that we have allies that recognize that the food industry does employ a lot of folks and recognize that things are unpredictable right now, but we're going to get through this.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. We will take a quick break right now, but please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
And we're back. We're talking about food regulatory issues. We spent the first part of the episode talking about supply chain, about issues with tariffs. In the second half, we're going to do a deep dive into what's happening with infant formula and counterfeiting.
Thanks, Wayne. Martin, we'll start with you following the break. Following the 2022 formula shortage, can you sort of talk about what specific measures the FDA has implemented to ensure a more resilient and responsive infant formula supply? and any really public-private partnerships or initiatives aimed at expanding domestic production or diversifying sources of infant formula. We know, I think just recently, FDA announced that it's initiating a comprehensive review of nutrients in infant formula. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about where things are at in this space.
FDA has done everything they can to make this as impossible and more challenging for the industry than
Mm,
should be the case. And I'm going to say something that may not be may sound very polite or appropriate, but FDA created the infant formula crisis.
mm,
They shut down Abbott. And at the time they shut down Abbott, the industry said they are producing, I think, somewhere between 40 to 60% of the US infant formula supply, and we are going to have shortages in 3 months. FDA heard that message on day one. All of my clients were having, in the infant formula industry, were they having weekly meetings with the agency back in February when Abbott shut down. Everybody warned the agency that this crisis was coming. The agency sat on their hands until May, and then they announced providing increased flexibility for bringing imported infant formula into the country. But by then, the shelves were barren. FDA then, 2 years later, comes out with this new policy in terms of how they expect clean breaks to take place, which has forced the infant formula industry to change practices that they've been using for 10, 15 years, decrease capacity because they're being forced to shut down so they can clean these massive facilities with much more frequency, which is putting further strains on infant formula supply. And so much of where we are today, and quite frankly, I still see the industry is worried that we are one recall away from another shortage. And I don't see FDA providing increased flexibility. I don't see new entries into the marketplace because as of today, it's still really, really complicated. And then the other thing that's going on is throughout the last administration, trying to get a new infant formula through the FDA process was a very, very cumbersome and tiresome process. They would spend months and months and months reassessing the food packaging that's being used to come in contact with these infant formulas that's been used for the infant formula industry for 20 years. And yet they were tying up and not approving new infant formula notifications because they got tied up on the packaging that was being used. So rather than see an agency that has been looking for ways to facilitate and allow for infant formula supplies to be regenerated and restocked, I've seen one hurdle after the other that's just adding increased complexity. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
thanks, Martin. No, that's really helpful. Tony, go ahead.
I just want to add in, and even at the ingredient innovation stage of formula, we've seen the agency sort of grind to a halt. So for a certain bioactive compound, the FDA led for human milk oligosaccharides and bringing innovative ingredients to the infant formula space. And right now, the agency has been completely deadlocked on lactoferrin and a number of other innovative ingredients. And I would note that a number of these are authorized for use in Europe already. And the industry has been working diligently to try to move these things forward at the agency and just roadblock after roadblock. We've had some ongoing dialogue, but it's just from the start of the chain to the end, as Martin described, it's been a extremely challenging for the industry the last number of years.
And I guess as a follow-up, Tony, what would you recommend sort of if you had FDA's ear to and kind of hearing from your clients, how to really improve both safety and access, and then also for your clients, how to navigate this regulatory flexibility while still maintaining, of course, these long-term safety standards?
Well, I think the agency needs to lean back into what made the U.S. and FDA a center for innovation, and to take an appropriate risk-based approach to whether you're talking about ingredient innovation or manufacturing. And again, they have to navigate. Understanding and navigating the politics is challenging, but and I've not been involved directly, but my understanding, even if you go back to the original Abbott shutdown, that nothing I've seen shows that I don't believe there's ever been a direct match from the illnesses to anything found in Abbott's plant. And they shut everything down without right now, between whole genome sequencing and advanced technology, this is not 15, 20 years ago when you were just using, DNA fingerprinting. I mean, the agency has incredible resources to refine those investigative techniques. And we are in this place where there isn't direct evidence.
Yep. Thanks, Tony. Martin, any other comments or thoughts?
No, look, I think that the infant formula space is an area where I think there are opportunities for improvements that need to be structural within the process.
Mm-hmm.
We have the Infant Formula Act. It sets very exacting requirements. We have manufacturing requirements are very exacting. But to Tony's point, we need to have an agency that it does set risk-based procedures. And just following on this whole issue about bioactives, there's basically been a moratorium on the approval of any more bioactives added to an infant formula. As soon as it's a bioactive, basically you're told the agency doesn't know how to assess safety, therefore they're not going to allow them to be added to the infant formula. That blocks innovation.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that breast milk is best, but we also know that there are components in breast milk that if we can make infant formula closer to breast milk, it's going to benefit those mothers who are unable to breastfeed or choose not to.
Yeah.
Martin and Tony, let me shift gears. That was a very interesting discussion on infant formula, and I think to those of us who have been following it, somewhat frustrating because it's such an important product. When I was at FDA, we dealt with infant formula issues, and that goes back a long, long way. It continues to be a regulatory issue. Martin, back to you for our last question. With the continuing increase of e-commerce and direct-to-consumer imports, how is the U.S. combating counterfeit food products entering the U.S. market, and how much of a problem is it?
I don't think we're doing a particularly great job of addressing counterfeits. I also don't know how big of a problem it is. We have had clients, I've been doing this for 35 and a half years, and many times we have clients that have gray market items, products that may be manufactured for the European market or for Canada or Mexico that are coming into this country in the gray market. We have tried to get the agency to prevent the shipment of those products. It's been very, very, very hard to do so, even when you can identify the port where they're coming through. So it's been frustrating, but I don't know that I see counterfeit in the food space as big of an issue as what it may be in the pharmaceutical space. But I also don't see it's an area where the agency has put a lot of time and resources.
Tony?
I tend to agree. I think in recognizing the challenge of the number of, up until recently, the number of products coming into the country, it is very challenging from an inspectional basis. But with that said, I think counterfeits more broad. The gray market is. I don't know how big a problem that is. We do, on occasion, have very significant issues with economic adulteration. Most recently with applesauce, previously with cumin, and those are very serious cases, and companies and FDA needs to use all the tools they have to identify them, but those are not happening on a weekly basis, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think over the years, I've had several clients, an olive oil manufacturer producing a product for the European market, one for the U.S., entirely different with different levels of pesticide residues, and it causing brand reputational harm in the U.S. And then I actually had a very large company where there were sister companies sort of undercutting the competition by having some gray market imports, unknown to the parent company. So I do think the issues, are there, but I agree that it is challenging for the FDA to identify and intercept. I think there are some protections that CBP and USPTO offer in terms of trademark recordation and legal rule protection that we've advised on. But I certainly agree that it is sort of an unclear space at the moment, and that labeling and other practices through private party agreements may be best, to address those. So no, thanks for your comments on those.
All three of you have identified some serious issues involving foods, but we all know that the number of people who are overseeing the food supply at FDA is going down. We'll see what happens with the next budget. How concerned are you about the ability of FDA moving forward to deal with some of the food issues that you've identified? Martin, let me start with you, and then Tony, and then ask Shelly to comment on it.
Look, I'm very concerned. My clients are very concerned. We've been proactively saying for the past several years that we need more funding for FDA, not less funding. We need to have more inspections. FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, was signed into law in 2011 by President Obama. It is now in operation, but we need to have FDA out there actively implementing FSMA, because if you have a cop on the beat, it raises the playing field for everybody. And we need to have an effective regulator. I'm also hearing, and you're probably going to asking later in the program about some of the new initiatives that are coming under MAHA. Those are regulatory initiatives that also require FDA. So I'm really concerned that we have this situation where we're decreasing the number of folks who are at FDA and putting even more burdens on them, which just means that the folks who are there can't possibly get everything done. And that's not good for us.
I couldn't agree more. Same concerns with my client base. Just the other week, Mike Rogers left the agency. It's unclear what kind of inspectional budget we're going to have at the end. There's been. I think it's fair to say that we have a highly dedicated, specialized workforce that is pretty demoralized right now, with a lot of their colleagues having been dismissed or taken an early retirement. In addition to the inspectional, the FDA was working on post-market review program for food ingredients. Unclear how that's going to be funded, whether there's going to be bandwidth for that. And, I think just stepping one step back too, just from the U.S. being a leader in innovation, I think that's starting to slip away as well. And the other thing we also need to think of here is the global reputation of the agency, where the agency is, if it's not focused on science and it's not being funded and it's not completing its enforcement obligations, I think other global agencies are taking notice of that.
Shelly, do you want to comment on that yourself?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with Martin and Tony's comments. I think that, same sort of sentiments, having fewer people being asked to do more is not sustainable in the long run. It creates risks, of course, delays in facility inspections, slower responses to outbreaks and recalls, and essentially and ultimately gaps in consumer protection, which is sort of the basis of the MAHA movement altogether. So I think there needs to be, a modernization of the workforce and a kind of focus on having retention, competitive pay, supporting career growth of the folks at the agency that are doing good important work. And then also, interagency coordination, partnerships, and really prioritizing the core areas that FDA wants to focus on with limited resources. So I think this is an extremely critical time.
Right. And Martin, you mentioned before MAHA, and it seemed as though you wanted to make a statement about it. So I won't ask you a question. I'll just say what just ask, what comments do you want to convey about MAHA? And then ask Tony the same question.
Yeah, I am biased here, but I don't see any science backing the MAHA agenda, and that scares me. When I hear the FDA commissioner and the secretary of HHS have a die about taking artificial colors out of the food supply and talking about how we have chronic disease right now and how diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, and the unhealthiness of the American population is due to the ingredients in the food and being part of a removal of red dyes or synthetic dyes, that's really troubling. Because quite frankly, the dyes that they're taking out of the food supply, and they've asked the industry to reformulate out those FD&C colors, the yellow 5, the yellow 6, they're safe. I mean, FDA has reviewed them. They've looked at the underlying studies. They are safe. They've actually been reviewed by the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, the European Food Safety Agency. They are safe ingredients. and their presence in the food supply have absolutely nothing to do with the chronic disease epidemic that we have in this country. Yet they're linking them to synthetic dyes. There was, I think, one honest statement where a commissioner did acknowledge that taking out dyes is not going to be a magic bullet. But I just find it very concerning that we have the focus and the demonization of food ingredients and completely overlooking the fact that there's a long history of safety behind them.
And if I can, I just, to jump on to the tail end of my friend Martin's comments here, can we just take a moment and use this to do a little bit of myth busting? And to that point, one of the larger concern is that we have senior government officials making statements that are false. We've heard government officials state that we have these synthetic dyes approved in the US that are banned in Europe. That is not true. In the EU, there are 15 synthetic dyes that are approved, and there were only nine approved in the US, and even in Canada, there were 10 synthetic dyes. And by the way, they're using this term petroleum-based. That is a PR, and I really prefer, and I know that's what's in the press release, but those of us who know better should not be echoing these talking points. These are not petroleum-based dyes. That is a scare tactic that, again, is not science-based and should not be used in common parlance, especially amongst experts. We're also seeing comments based, the other talking point that we've seen a lot of is that there's 10,000 additives used in the US and only 400 approved in Europe. Again, completely false. The 10,000 number comes from a paper published in 2011 by Neltner and al. Following the Pew Trust Food Additive Initiative, which Martin and I had I'll use the word pleasure of providing industry perspective to. That paper, that number not only did double counted ingredients that were on the market here, but they included everything that touches, they included food packaging. They even counted pesticide residues. And in fairness to the authors, the paper was titled 10,000 Chemicals in Food, and it was about the food additive authorization process. That has been spun into 10,000 food additives, and it's being compared to the 400-ish. It's actually about probably really like 352 additives in the EU that have an E number, a Europe number, and those are additives with a specific technical function. When you actually add in everything in Europe, including novel foods, enzymes, grandfathered ingredients, you end up with about the same, they're not making food magically in Europe out of nothing. And I'd also note that in Europe, so novel foods, pre-1997, if it was substantially consumed, you can go to market without any review. Food contact, we have a much more comprehensive regulatory program around food contact materials in this country. EU doesn't look at any paperboard materials. Additionally, colors from foodstuffs in the EU can go to market without any authorization. In the US, every color has to go through a color additive petition. You can't just magically bring natural colors to market in the US. So, I think it's really important that that both the industry and the food science community and more broadly are trying to get factual information out to give proper context around how the food system and how FDA regulates the food products and food ingredients in this country. And this time, I will step off my soapbox and hand it back to Martin.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to move on. You two have identified some very significant issues with what's going on right now. They clearly need to be addressed. Every single person in the world is vested in food safety. And the American food supply is taken for granted that it's safe, and now we have to watch and make sure that that continues to be the case, and that our foods do remain safe, and we deal with imports, and we deal with supply, and we deal with all the issues that you've raised. But we're going to shift gears. We're going to turn briefly to our resource link segment, where we provide you with some valuable links that you might want to check out. So, Shelly, let's share them with our audience right now.
Will do, Wayne, but I want to first point out that these links will be included on our website, fdawatch.net. So no need to write anything down.
Let's look first at our pharma resource link. The new head of the Center for Biologics, Vinay Prasad, is an oncologist. He's previously criticized FDA leadership and COVID-19 mandates. He succeeds Peter Marks, who, as we know, oversaw the approval of COVID-19 vaccines, but he was pushed out of the agency a few months ago. There have been a lot of stories about Dr. Prasad's appointment. In the research link, we refer you to one story from Reuters, and I would also refer you to an interesting interview that Dr. Makari, the new commissioner, did with Dr. Prasad. FDA has an internal way of doing broadcast, and Dr. Makari clearly, very, very clearly, if you watch this particular episode, is going to be actively involved in that. And in this episode, which was on YouTube, and we will link to it, or provide the link, he interviewed Dr. Prasad. Well worth watching to not only see something about Dr. Prasad, but also to see how I think FDA intends to communicate in the future. With regard to medical devices, there's a link from the University of Pennsylvania's Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics from their blog. There was an article titled AI in Healthcare and the FDA's Blind Spot. And it discusses a new study from Assistant Professor of Medicine Gary Weissman. It simulates how two large language models might be used by a clinician and demonstrates that they provide device-like clinical decision support even when directed otherwise. When asked by interviewer and Penn Director of Strategic Initiatives, Christine Weeks, about the study's methodology, Weissman said, and I quote, "The work was informed by the text of the FDA guidance document about what kinds of decision support software might qualify as a device." And he added, "There are some very interesting assumptions in that guidance document, many of which are not necessarily evidence-based or built upon well-validated constructs." It's an interesting interview. It deals with the idea of software as a medical device. I just want to note that we've touched on the same subject in previous episodes of our podcast, such as our episode titled "What's Happening in Software and Device Regulations" with Jennifer Newberger and Michael Gaba. That episode, and of course the link to the Penn interview, are available at fdawatch.net.
Thanks, Wayne. Let's look at our foods links, both from Reuters. Tyson Foods and yogurt maker Dannon are among companies working to remove dyes from products sold in the U.S. According to the article on Tyson Foods, the company is proactively reformulating food products containing synthetic dyes and plans to eliminate them from production by the end of May. On a company earnings call, CEO Donnie King added that Tyson's retail branded products, including its chicken nuggets, don't contain these types of dyes. As for Dannon, CEO Shane Grant said the company is looking to remove such dyes from its U.S. portfolio, including products under the Yo Crunch and Light and Fit brands. He added that roughly 2% of the company's products use such dyes. Of course, this is interesting news in having companies adjust and reformulate products given the agency's new mandates, and we'll continue to take a close look at how this issue progresses. And finally, let's turn to our cosmetics link. PCPC issued a statement last month on New York bills SB 2057 and AB 2054, which propose bans on what the council calls safe, commonly used ingredients, including preservatives that help maintain the shelf life of many cosmetics and personal care products. The statement notes that if the bill passes as written, it will force trusted brands off the market, leaving New Yorkers with fewer options and irreparably harming our industry's small business and entrepreneurs, citing significant supply chain disruptions due to the resulting state compliance requirements. Our link will go to PCPC statement, with which the council included the downloadable New York State ingredient fact sheets. Again, this link and all of these links are available at fdawatch.net. And on that note, Wayne, it's time to thank Tony and Martin for really their time and being such insightful guests on this episode. Thank you so much, Martin and Tony. We really appreciate your perspectives and insights.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd also like to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister.
And Shelly, let me conclude as we always do. I want to give everybody who is listening the opportunity to suggest or be a guest on our show, or to be a marketing partner or a sponsor, or just a comment on the show. We welcome all comments. We welcome all interaction with the podcast. You can contact us at info, I-N-F-O, at fdawatch.net, info at fdawatch.net. Definitely check out our website, fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net. Finally, we'd appreciate it if you're so inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It really does make a difference. And remember to follow us and to subscribe. That's the only way to make sure you won't miss a single episode of FDA Watch, and you can subscribe on fdawatch.net.
And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.